Romans chapter 3, verse 10 states that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. When men exalt self above God, they fall short of the glory of God. When men exalt tradition above God, they fall short of the glory of God. When men exalt human ingenuity above God, they fall short of the glory of God. When men break God's laws, even if it is with good intentions, they fall short of the glory of God. Therefore, the question we must consider is whether or not the celebrations of man-made Christian holidays that are rooted in pagan traditions glorify God. This is a question that only you, the listener of this video, can answer for yourself. However, in making that decision, it's vital that you get it right, that we are in harmony with how God views it. Therefore, we will take a look at the historical information. Historically, we know that when the ancient heathen worshipped Baal in the grove, they fell short of the glory of God. And when Israel turned from Jehovah and worshipped Baal in the grove, they fell short of the glory of God. Based upon that understanding, I have concluded that for me to associate Christ with the traditions of Baal and grove is for me to fall short of God's glory. In 1 Corinthians 6, 14 through 15, it says, "Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers, for what fellowship has righteousness with unrighteousness, and what communion has light with darkness? And what concord has Christ with Belial? Or what part has he that believes with an infidel?" According to McClintock and Strong's Encyclopedia, Belial simply means worthlessness, lawlessness, or reckless, having to do with wickedness. Certainly, to associate Jesus Christ with the traditions of Baal in the grove is to associate Christ with worthless wickedness. In 1 Corinthians 6:15, the Apostle Paul is asking what fellowship Christ has with wicked foolishness. The context of Paul's discussion is a connection of believers having fellowship with unbelievers and believers having fellowship with wicked foolishness. Paul uses the comparisons of unrighteousness with righteousness and darkness with light and God with idols. This theme concludes in verse 17 with the admonition to come out from among them and be ye separate and touch not the unclean thing. What was occurring in the Corinthian church that brought about this admonition from Paul? Well, perhaps Henry Haley can give us some insight into this admonition, taken from Haley's Handbook of the Bible. Quote, "Venus was the principal deity of Corinth. Her temple was one of the most magnificent buildings in the city. In it, 1,000 priestesses, public prostitutes, were kept at public expense. They're always ready for immoral indulgence as worship to their goddess." Some of the Corinthian Christians, having been used to a religion that encouraged immoral living, were finding it a little hard to adapt themselves to their new religion, which prohibited immoral living. Paul had said in discussing certain things that all things are lawful. Some of them evidently were quoting this to justify their promiscuous sexual indulgence. Paul positively states that it does not so apply, and positively, in unmistakable language, prohibits Christians from such indulgences. Now, as stated previously, Venus is Ashtaroth, the goddess of fertility, represented by the evergreen tree. Certainly, an evergreen tree in the forest growing in its natural environment is not evil, but rather a testimony to the magnificence of God's creation. However, it becomes a suspect practice when it is removed from its natural environment to be used in the worship in the same manner that it was used in the worship of both Baal and Venus. God does not endorse such practice in the Bible, and although Christmas is not specifically mentioned in the Bible, the use of the evergreen tree in worship is always presented as forbidden and evil. The statement that Christmas is not mentioned in the Bible, I'm sure, was a shock to many. However, this statement is true because the Christ Mass is not mentioned in the Bible, and the pagan traditions are not mentioned in the Bible in association with the incarnation of Christ. And therefore, even though the incarnation is clearly taught in the Bible, the celebration of Christmas is not. Even the celebration of the incarnation of Christ is not mentioned in recognition of in Scripture. Historically, we know that the first century and possibly even the second century church did not recognize nor even conceive of such celebration. In 1 Corinthians 6:15, the Apostle Paul is making a connection between the worship of Christ and the religious traditions of Venus worship. Paul does not accuse the Corinthian Christians of worshiping Venus, but rebukes them for associating Christ with the traditions of Venus worship. Following the example of Paul, I am not accusing my fellow Christians of worshiping Venus or Bel, but of associating the religious traditions of Venus and Bel with Christ. This is a charge to which many prominent pastors have admitted, and yet they argue that there is nothing wrong with the use of Christmas traditions and symbols in the worship of Christ. It seems to me that the Apostle Paul would not agree with that sentiment. Christians immediately recognize paganism in the celebration of Halloween, abandoning it in mass numbers. Every year, more and more Christians apply the principle presented in 1 Corinthians 6 to the celebration of Halloween, condemning its celebration and symbolism and admonishing other Christians to abstain from its celebration. The same Christians who correctly and rightly condemn the celebration of Halloween a few months hence are in full celebration with the pagan symbolism of Christmas, and in the spring full celebration with the pagan symbolism of Easter, openly and loudly associating the pagan symbols with Christ, condemning anyone who would oppose their celebration. The immediate defense is to accuse anyone who would question such celebrations as being the incarnation of Charles Dickens' fictional character Scrooge. In essence, I am the bah humbug Christian if I don't celebrate Christmas. I can only hope that absent a better argument than one taken from the fictional tale of an accomplished fiction author, believers would give serious consideration to more substantive arguments. Absent more substantive arguments, it can only be concluded that the celebration of pagan traditions and Christian holidays is nothing more than an emotional attachment to them. If any and all forms of symbolism are permissible in the worship of Christ, then it is my contention that during the month of December I should display a swastika, or even perhaps a pentagram, to be hung in the place of the green wreath upon my front door, and call it the Star of Bethlehem. It would be no less pagan than the green wreath, in that it is the symbol of the ancient Yule fire wheel. Before the swastika was a symbol of racism in the Third Reich, it was a symbol of the fire wheel, or the symbol of the year. Each point on the swastika represented a particular time of year, such as the solstice, the equinoxes, the Yule, and Halloween and Easter. Modern Hindus still use the swastika as a symbol of the year in their religion, and meaning given to it far more ancient than its use by the Third Reich. Now, if you find the concept of hanging a swastika or pentagram on your door to represent the Star of Bethlehem and associate with Christ offensive and an insult to Christ, then why would you not also find the use of the symbol of Venus, the grove or the evergreen tree, the Yule log, and the wreath on the front door also an insult to Christ? The root question leading to the heart of this discussion and the core of the principle presented here is simply, are we at liberty to worship Christ in any old manner we choose? Consider the following verse. Ye shall utterly destroy all the ye shall utterly destroy all the places wherein the nations which ye shall possess serve their gods, and upon high mountains, and upon hills, and upon every green tree. And ye shall overthrow their altars, and break their pillars, and burn their groves with fire. And ye shall hew down the graven images of their gods, and destroy the names of them out of that place. End quote. God did not say to take the symbols of the pagans and use them in worship of Jehovah God. He told them to destroy the pagan symbols. Now consider this verse, 2 Kings 18:4. He removed the high places and brake the images and cut down the groves and brake in pieces the brazen serpent that Moses had made. For unto those days the children of Israel did burn incense to it, and he called it Nehushtan. Now notice that the issue in 2 Kings 18:4 was their misuse of the brazen serpent in worship. God commanded Moses to lift the serpent upon the pole for the salvation of Israel from the deadly vipers that were injecting the venomous poison. However, the children of Israel perverted the original intent of the brazen serpent, resulting in God's disapproval. If the method of worship is ordained of God, it is permitted, just as the cherubim graven images were commanded of God to be fashioned above the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant. Any other use of cherubim in worship would have been condemned. The ordained use of graven images by God in his worship, for example, the cherubims, was not a violation of the second commandment, which states that we should not make unto ourselves any graven images, nor any likeness of anything in the earth above, nor upon the earth below, nor in the waters below the earth. Considering this commandment, we must ask ourselves, what images or symbols of worship, likeness of an image, God has ordained for use in Christmas worship? To justify its use, we must be expressly and clearly recorded in the Bible as being ordained for use in that particular celebration. Now, in light of the overwhelming volume of Scripture condemning Bell and Grove, and the use of unauthorized symbols in worship, I can only ponder the reason many Protestants condemn the use of images for the worship in the Roman Catholic Church, and yet they likewise use images in celebrating the incarnation of Christ. There is no command or admonition in Scripture to celebrate the incarnation of Christ, and there especially is no command to associate it with the symbolism of paganism. This being the case, I ask again, where we find our authority to commence with the Christmas celebration and its pagan symbolism. Historically, we can only assert that authority in association with the ancient halls of the Roman Catholic Church. The Protestant Reformation ended its celebration in the Protestant Church until the until the late 1800s. The Puritans banned it because they viewed it as an abomination. Now, in McClintock and Strong, they provide, in their encyclopedia, they provide us with a concise and accurate history of the celebration of Christmas. And to give a short excerpt, the observance of Christmas is not of divine appointment, nor is it of New Testament origin. The day of Christ's birth cannot be ascertained from the New Testament, or indeed from any other source. The fathers of the first 3 centuries did not speak of any special observance of the Nativity. And then consider this. It was celebrated with all the marks of respect usually bestowed on high festivals, and distinguished also by the custom derived probably from heathen antiquity of interchanging presents and making entertainments. At the same time, the heathen winter holidays, Saturnalia, Juvenalia, and Vermalia, were undoubtedly transformed and, so to speak, sanctified by the establishment of the Christmas cycle of holidays and the heathen customs, so far as they were harmless, what we think is harmless. The giving of presents and lighting tapers were brought over into Christmas use. And then consider the Yule. Yule was the fire wheel, and it was a sun feast, commemorative of the turn of the sun and the lengthening of the day, and seems to have been a period of pagan festival in Europe from ancient times. What about the demons in the association with Christmas? Well, daemon in Greek is a word which is translated devil, but it means to distribute fortunes. Now, for example, Plato in his Catalyst derives the word from daemon, knowing, or that's part of the etymology, but it comes down to distributing fortunes. And yet we distribute fortunes from underneath Venus, the Christmas tree. And once again, what authority do we find to do that?